our happiness is better served if we are not setting ourselves up for a pass-fail, a goal that will either be met or failed, and instead trying to have something sustainable, if that makes sense.
Hi, Josh. It's so good to have you back here to be my guinea pig yet again. I'm trying this idea of going back to some of my guests to take a deeper dive in some of the topics that I think are relevant to us as a musicians or music learner, or even just greater, a learner in general. That I think it will be very interesting to see what our guest experience are telling us and what their perspective are. And I have my mind on talking to you about goal setting for a while, or just having goals in general, because you have a YouTube channel that you have been running for 11 years, that you've been consistently putting things in there. So there's, I think, this belief in Team Talking Harps that perhaps you're very goal oriented and goal focused, and I'm not sure if that's necessarily the case, but that enough, it was a very curious question in our mind, and I thought, why don't we talk about goal setting? And it's also New Year, which, what everyone does in New Year is you set your New Year goal, right? So here we go. Goal setting. So first question, do you actually go down and write out all the different goals of things that you want to achieve?
No, absolutely not. No, I guess I'm not really a huge believer in believer in, I guess, having goals, but not necessarily having to put them down or even consciously define them. And I was thinking, because you asked me about goals, and thinking about getting started learning something, getting started learning to play the harp or any instrument, or that there must be something that starts one down that path, right? And so a goal of maybe playing the harp, maybe you hear somebody play the harp, oh, I wish I could play like that, right? I want to do that. But I guess I'm a firm believer in that once you start doing something, it tends to be much better to fall in love with that process and love the process and let any goals take care of themselves, if that makes sense.
I actually think it does, because I have here in my notes, and I'm going to try to read it because I haven't memorized it, but a American psychologist, Adam Grant, which I have a lot of
Right.
respect for his work. He, in one of the articles, and I'll put a link in the video description, he shared his goal making process in the article, and it's a 5-step process. He says, step 1, you start with an extremely specific goal. Step 2, you make your goal extremely meaningful. Number 3, you make your goal extremely positive. And then number 4, you set your very specific, meaningful, positive goal, and then you forget about your goal. And step 5 is to focus not on the goal, but on the process. And I am a very process person, and I didn't even realize that until I start planning for this chat, because I was asking myself, do I actually set goal? And I have participated in some studies where they ask you, do you have goals for your weekly goals for harp? And 9 out of 10 times my answer is no, I don't. So then that got me wondering, like, is that a improper approach towards learning, or is goal just one mean to meet an end, or is the process more important? And it sounds like the process to you is more important than the goal itself.
Yeah, and you think about, because again, I think often the sort of the school mentality of where there's always a goal, like getting that grade, or you think of some of the countries where there's a huge exam after high school that sort of maybe determines, it seems like it determines your future, right? And a huge focus on these goals, but I'm not sure, first of all, that that's a particularly comfortable mindset to be in, and also, does that continue? So I think I sent you a link talking about looking at the particular Olympian who won gold, achieved his goal, but he really struggled. And of course, we can also fail a goal and really struggle as well when you have these sort of really strongly held things, because the thing is, life keeps going. What's the classic saying? Is before enlightenment, chop wood and carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood and carry water. That we have to, again, the idea of the process, that not to get too caught up in a goal, right? And to instead, and again, that idea that if you're, let's say your goal is to play, looking at music, to play a particular piece of music. You heard somebody play this, and maybe it's really difficult, and you're like, that's my goal, that's my end goal. But if it turns out that you don't enjoy playing and practicing the harp, then why put yourself through the misery of trying to keep reminding yourself of that goal and forcing yourself through there? The very famous French harpist Henriette Renier, she was a very famous teacher, and apparently she would always ask, do you love the harp? And students would have to love the harp in order for her to consider taking them on as a student. Anyway, I just think we should, as much as possible, think about no goal, like an endless goal, as it were, or I read an interesting book the other day. What was it called? The Infinite Game, I think, which is sort of business, but talking about, in business, are you thinking about sort of winning, or are you thinking about trying to have a business that can last for centuries? And that I think our happiness is better served if we are not setting ourselves up for a pass-fail, a goal that will either be met or failed, and instead trying to have something sustainable, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and actually, when you talk about happiness, it reminds me of Sean Aker, the writer of The Happiness Advantage, who says that we have this tendency of, we're saying if we're gonna meet a goal, then we're gonna be successful. And when you're successful, you're happy. But what happened is when we meet a goal, we set the next goal. So you meet a sales target, you set a higher sales target. And if you make a good grade, you're gonna make better grades. So you're moving that goalpost, and your brain never achieves happiness. And the case he was trying to make was that when your brain is happy, you're actually more productive and you're more effective. So I can see how goal can be counterproductive, and I would take myself as an example. Back in my piano days, I was told, you're gonna you're gonna take the grade 1 exam, and then you're gonna do it all the way till grade 6. So at the end of grade 1, it's like, okay, you did this, you got your result, that's great. Now on to the next, and I end up in this sort of cycle of chasing this goal, this target that was set to me. And then I don't know how much of that is because I wasn't very hands-on in the goal setting process. It was just a goal that was, given to me. But nowadays, when I am learning the harp, I take a very different approach. I remember coming to you and telling you that I have no interest in taking harp exam. I just want to learn to play beautiful music. And it gives you that, it's almost like what that infinite goal that you talk about, that endless goal, right? And we're taking a lot of, my husband called them side trips, that I'll go into doing different things but it ultimately filled the bucket of playing beautiful music. Does that resonate with you? Is that kind of how you see?
Absolutely. So like for me, I could say that my goal is to play music as well and as beautifully as I can. And that is a goal that has no end point, because I can always try to play more beautifully. I mean, presumably as I get older, I may not be able to have quite the dexterity at some point, but that musically I could continue to play more and more beautifully. And so I love that type of goal. I mean, Pablo Casals is reported to have said, why does he keep practicing at age 80? Because I think I'm continuing to improve, or something like that. And so it's not as if there's no reason or goal, but it's this kind of again, not a pass-fail goal, but one that keeps drawing you on and on.
Mm-hmm. So I work a full-time job outside of here, and we have a lot of deadlines are imposed to us. And I think in those cases, there's a definite advantage of setting a goal and sort of work your way towards the goal. What do you do that for some of the projects that you have deadline for? Like, how do you feel about that? Do you see that as a goal-setting exercise, or do you see it more of a time management exercise?
Yeah, I guess I haven't. I went. So it might be first that kind of far distance goal of the concept of, okay, I want to publish a book of music, okay? And so then that will hang around there, and I will gradually start towards it, because again, I don't have a specific deadline. It's not as if I have a publisher saying, okay, well, by January we need this manuscript in our hands, right? And then at some point I will give myself a deadline when it seems that it's close enough that the deadline can, of course, be very, very helpful for actually getting something out the door, right? To say, okay, no matter what happens, it's going out the door at this point. So, because the temptation is always, oh, well, it can be a little bit better, but I guess I haven't viewed that in the lens of goal setting.
So it's what I would describe as a time management, sort of project management type
Sure.
reason to kind of make sure you stay on track. But let's take a look at, say, from a learner's perspective, for someone that perhaps is not the current me. For perhaps it would be the me many years ago, and I'm learning the new instrument, and I was told, you're gonna do this and this by this time. Do you think that is helpful for learning? I mean, I learned the piano. I wouldn't say I'm very good at it, but like, what are some of the pros and cons of having that type of goal when it comes to learning, you think?
Yeah, because again, I think for me, I'm not a believer in the whole sort of graded exam system, which again kind of ties into the same sort of school system where the goal is to become more proficient at the instrument and to know specific knowledge or whatever, and whether you pass or fail an exam really says nothing about that, right? Like it's I think it's tricky, because again, I think a lot of times when we think about learning, we're thinking about a school environment, and one of the things about a school environment is oftentimes, a lot of the time, most of the people there aren't particularly invested in trying to learn this. They're not saying, oh, I love the harp, I want to learn that, it's so then as a teacher, being able to do what you can to maybe provide a goal that even if maybe they're not interested intrinsically in this particular subject, they're interested in the goal, and of course maybe potentially just getting an A, that's the goal, great, okay. So I think it can of course be effective in the sense of learning, but I don't know if it's effective in the sense of loving what you've learned and continuing to learn that, right? To continue that sense of continuing to learn and learn and learn, that endless goal. But everyone's different, right? Because again, I think some people crave a structure more than others, right? And so that to be able to say, okay, here we are, this is grade 1, we're going to learn these pieces, and for some people that can be really effective. But I do think it's removing a little bit from just the pure love of and desire and addiction to creating music.
Yeah, so I think what I'm hearing is that for you, that intrinsic motivation of really wanting to do that is more important than having a goal that drives you to go and do that action.
Exactly.
Yeah, and interestingly, in my reading, what I've found is that there's a lot of suggestions that good goal setting will lead to task performance, but it doesn't necessarily lead to improving job satisfaction, like in a work setting. Right. And I would assume that is the case too in learning. I don't think having a goal doesn't always guarantee that you're happy with what you're doing.
Well, and again, I think that also ties into the idea that the importance of process, because the goal is not there with you every day, right? But the process is what you do every day. So that if you can improve, same as work, like if you can improve the process of whatever you're doing, each if that feels better, then the whole experience is going to feel better, right? And so I guess sometimes I think for learning music and for learning skills, sometimes there is that desire, there is that dream, that goal of, oh, I want to play an instrument well, but can't I just take a pill and do it immediately, right? And so again, to somehow treat the process not as a pill to be taken, but as something to be embraced, that this is actually the essence. So music, learning an instrument, is not that recital. It's all those moments you spend on your own or with other people, but practicing and working and getting better and better.
And I think that is a good way to create meaning in your work, which I think the meaning will give you that satisfaction more than reaching the goal. Now, there's this notion that what doesn't get measured doesn't get done. So if you don't set goal, how do you know if you're hitting towards that bigger overarching picture that you're striving for? How do you keep yourself motivated and believing that you're still on track? What are some of the things you do?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think one of the interesting things is a music teacher, right? You always get that experience of you hear somebody once a week, or maybe once every 2 weeks, or once a month, whereas the person learning is hearing themselves every day. So, and music is kind of rare in the sense of so many of the pursuits that we do, we can maybe not master them, but get them to an acceptable level in a reasonably short amount of time. So this idea of spending 2 years learning an instrument and still not being very good at it, right? I mean, that's what's with that? But that from that day to day, it's maybe harder to hear and feel and see improvement. But from that little bigger perspective, weekly or bi-weekly or monthly, it becomes much more clear that, oh yes, there is improvement going on. But again, I think, are we practicing to see improvement, or are we practicing to be able to play music the way we want to, right? And so, yeah, to have that music be that goal. But yes, but certainly. So I think recording yourself these days, it's so easy to record yourself, and so it can be very helpful, I think, to record yourself, and then maybe just to record that, and then look back a month later and realize that, oh, that piece that I was struggling with, it sounds better now. And to do some of that sort of self-teaching, right? To try to move on that path to being your own teacher of again, listening, recording yourself and listening and saying, does this sound the way I want it to? What could make it sound better, right? How could things sound better? But again, that idea of a goal of, if your goal is to play better, that's not a pass-fail. It's not that you reach a certain point and you're measured and, oh, you succeeded, or, oh, you failed. It's a constant thing, right? It's just a constant thing every day, right? And some days will be better than others, and to have that patience of, even if it doesn't feel as if there's a lot of progress being made, just enjoy the process and keep going.
That is something that I've learned from you when I was recording a couple of pieces in the last little bit because I was off work. And I generally in the past will really want to just get the piece over with, and I just want to record it and get it done. Right? And after taking lessons with you for a while, and I have one piece, the Skyfall song, that I have set on for a year, and it came so much differently than it was a year ago. And I came to appreciate that some of the stuff that just need time. And if I had the goal, which I did, to say record it by this day so I can tick it off, I certainly didn't meet that goal. But it didn't mean I couldn't meet it later. I find that time perspective has been a very interesting point for me, coming from a environment that, I grew up in the school system in Asia, where there's constant deadlines one after another. You're being told, if you don't get this by this date, which is when the test comes, then you failed. You get a red little something on your on your report card, right? But it doesn't mean I couldn't do it. It might just be I can do it maybe later, right?
Exactly. No, exactly, right? That you didn't have that opportunity to succeed at that later, right? And so that's I think really important to not feel again that a failure is failure forever or something like that. That it's just at that moment in time it wasn't possible, right? And it may never be possible, right? But that it's not this sort of harsh line. I think that's really important.
Yeah, I agree.
And again, I think so. Different environments, there may be different deadlines and different pressures, but if you have the luxury of learning an instrument without any huge pressure on results, is just being kind to yourself and patient with yourself, and it's great to I think it's great to set a goal of I want to record this piece at a certain time or whatever, but that if that deadline doesn't get met, to not feel that it's a failure, right? That it's just constantly sort of adjusting one's expectations, and again keeping in mind that learning music is a challenging and long process, right? And sort of that sort of lifelong goal rather than that 2-month goal type of thing.
Yeah, and in a recent conversation that Sheryl Sandberg, she's I think she's COO with Facebook. She talked about career. She answered a question from the audience in one of the I guess Q&A she given in one of the universities, and she said that if you have set your career goal and you kind of fixated on it, you might actually miss out on other opportunities that comes out. Do you find yourself having that open goal opens you up to more possibility because you have that open mind? Is that your experience?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and of course, there's advantages to both, right? Because obviously that very narrow-minded focus on a particular goal is sometimes the only way to, and certainly I'm very focused on music, right? Is sometimes the only way to achieve that. And but I think that broad range is really powerful. David Epstein wrote a great book called Range, which really talks about that our picture of the hyper-focused individual is actually, in general, not true. That most highly successful people have had careers in many different fields and have had experiences in many different fields. That Nobel Prize-winning scientists are much more likely to have also done art or other activities. That broadening, I guess, is good, right? And also that, I guess, that sense of being willing to adjust to reality, or to new information, rather than feeling that I set this path and it's the only way to go.
I operate that way a lot. In the PDCA cycle, the plan, do, check, act, and I live to shorten that cycle as much as I can. Right. And I take in that data, and I actually see my lesson with you every week as one of those cycles. And at the end of each lesson, I might have learned new information that is going to change completely what I thought I would be doing, or put me in a different direction. And what I found is that when I'm open to using that information, I feel less defeated by the process, if that makes sense. Because I think if I told myself I'm going to learn something, and I set myself that goal and try to do it without realizing maybe some stuff, the name should not be named here, but it's just never going to happen for me. I'm going to end up being quite upset about it. But if I'm going to be able to take in the new information and adjust my plan, I think it's more helpful. So how often do you adjust your plan? Do you use your new data to adjust your plan.
Well, and again, I think it's a balance, right? Because it's so hard, right? Because I think as humans, we like to have an absolute. This is the way it is, right? And so if I feel that maybe in general people are too much focused on goals, I'm trying to swing the pendulum back this way. But at the same time, there are many, so for example, to have something and to continue to work on it, even if it feels hard or unrewarding in that moment in time, that of course can be very helpful as well. But it's finding that balance, right? It's not feeling it has to be one or the other. It's trying to feel for yourself, is this useful, right? Is this sort of same as something like working out, right? Is this a good level of stress on the body, or is this a bad level of stress on the body, right? That it's not that it should feel maybe super easy, but anyway, finding paying attention to one's own experiences, I guess. And so I will often have a piece that I'm maybe thinking of learning but haven't fully committed to, so in other words, a piece that's not written for the harp, but that I think I can maybe adapt to the harp. And sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you maybe don't get very far in the process and think, or I'll look at this later. Or maybe sometimes I get quite far in the process of learning it, but then just feel that it's not going to work, or again, maybe down the road. At the same time, I know, so for my first recital, one of the pieces I played was Hovhannis's Sonata for Harp, which is, so Hovhannis was a contemporary American composer who died in the last 20 years, I want to say. And so his music was, for me at the time, this is in 1994, I guess I started learning it probably in 92 or something, a little strange, right? A little bit wasn't exactly what I was used to hearing. And was of the pieces on that program was probably the one I connected to the least to start with, and maybe the least enjoyable. But so again, it's that balance, right? It wasn't that my teacher was saying, "Oh, you absolutely have to play this." I could have said, "No, I don't want to play this." But at the same time, there was that encouragement that, you should play this. And I mean, listening to it now, it sounds very easy listening. It's like, but it's not particularly far out there. But that ended up being a good experience for me. I expanding my ear, like playing something that was sort of out of my comfort zone a little bit, and putting in that time. And again, that idea that, yes, love the process, but also realize that the process is not going to be ecstatic at every moment in time. We don't want to we don't need to search for that sense of, this is amazing every time we sit down at the harp. Like sometimes maybe you're tired, but you're just going to commit to playing that day. And sorry, just to segue into that idea of goals. So a goal I can really get behind is the idea of a small daily goal. That idea, say, of playing every day, even if it's just for 10 minutes. Using goals like that to create habits so that you don't end up having to think about it. You're just going to play every day or whatever your schedule is like, but to use goals to establish habits like that so that it's not a pass-fail goal, but I think from all I've read, right, that's one of the best ways to establish a habit is to make it a habit, right? Is to if it's something you want to do, is to make sure you're doing it every day so that it doesn't become a choice. It becomes an automatic thing. And goal setting in that sense, I think, is very, very helpful.
So a large part of the whole goal setting theory is that you have the goal and then you work towards the goal and it will ensure some kind of task completion. So if you don't have a very specific goal, what are some of the strategy you use to ensure you're actually working towards that ultimate goal?
Right. And I guess I do have specific goals. I just don't necessarily think of them in that way. So I'm typically working towards a concert program. So that music, that will be a goal to get these pieces in performance shape. But that's very much in the back of my mind as I'm working on them, right? If that makes sense. And so I think for most people learning music, you get a new piece of music and the goal is to try to play it as well as you can, right? and that goal is there, but it's more important to think about how you're practicing it, right? And rather than the goal that you have of playing it, if that makes sense.
It does, because what I realize is even if you, as my teacher, give me a goal, it doesn't mean I will have the means to achieve the goal if I don't think about the
Sure.
how or the process. And one of the things that I have tried to get my daughter to learn since she learned the harp is I want her to learn how to learn. To figure out the process, because if I have to be the one sitting next to her every single day to tell her what to do, she's repeating my instruction, but it doesn't help her synthesize the instruction in a way that may have meanings for her, and I will end up being this attachment of hers next to the harp every time she practices, which to me is it's kind of meaningless, right? So I think that like that the how to me is way more important than having that very specific goal of saying today I'm gonna do 3 measures or 2 lines, and I would generally say, I'll sit down and give myself a rough idea of like, this is how much I want to cover, but I could be 1 measure in and realize that this 4 pedal change that occurs between page 1 and page 2 of Song in the Night is going to take 2 weeks. And at that point, the how to make that happen become way more important than when this is going to happen, I think.
And so I think again that as you learn a piece, the most effective way to practice that will change over time, right? And so you could think of those as little mini goals. Okay, right now what this piece needs is this particular bar we're going to practice 4 times, or this particular section is going to be practiced 5 times, or whatever. But I guess for me, I wouldn't be thinking of that as a goal. I would be thinking of that as a process. Okay, right now I'm going to try this particular strategy working on this piece and see how that works. So one of the pieces that I'm working on right now is a piece that I've never played before, and it's gotten to the point where now I can start with, you kind of get the shape of the piece, and then maybe working on different little bits and trying to get this sounding good and that sounding good and the whole thing playing through. And now I have very specific breakdown of, okay, I play this 3 times through, and then the next section 3 times through, this 3 times through. But it feels very organic somehow. And again, partly maybe because I've been doing it for so long, right? Because again, I think that is something that can be very helpful, is to help give people some ways to learn, right? So instead of here's a piece, learn it. Okay, how, right? To break down some ideas and strategies, but again, maybe not with a idea of this is the goal, that this is the process, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. And I certainly see you as a mentor, and not to say that you're not superior in your harp playing, but when we're in a lesson, I very much see you as someone that I can bounce ideas off, that I'm getting feedback into what I think I should be doing, or maybe you'll pick up on something that I'm missing, and that process is very interactive. Whereas I think in a lot of the traditional learning setting, the students are a lot more passive, right? You sit in the room and then, the direction comes from the teacher. Sure. And it's very one directional. Whereas I think now at this point in my life, after learning many things and realizing what works and what doesn't, I'm a lot more interactive in my learning, which I think it puts the teacher in maybe a different role.
Absolutely, right? Because ideally it's again, the only one who can learn something is ourselves, right? Because nobody can go inside our brain and put this information in there, or this, these feelings. So it's taking charge of one's own learning, right? And that obviously, again, it's a balance, because if you can find a teacher who you trust and work with, then sometimes you have to just accept that, okay, they told me to do this, I'm going to do this. I'm not sure if it's going to work, but I'm just going to do this, right? Especially I think when first starting an instrument, right? Because everything can feel so foreign, right? I think about trying to learn the violin, and that you can't rely on your own intuition or your own feelings to a huge extent that you're just relying on, okay, this is the way to do it. But that even then, and certainly as you get more proficient, to pay attention, it's your own body and your own mind, right, that's involved. And so to what is working for you, what are the challenges that you're feeling, what feels easy, what feels hard, and just taking charge of one's own learning, right?
And to go back to an earlier point that you make, that some people benefit from having a more structured kind of goal and whatnot to work towards, and someone works like us where we're more general, higher level term that's just overarching, and that is something that I have really learned and keep reminding myself. And when people ask me, is Josh a good harp teacher? I said, well, it depends on what you need from a teacher. Exactly. If you need something that is very specific and very directional, it might not be, that you may not get it from one teacher over another. It really comes down to getting a good match, right?
Exactly. And so for me, I very much feel that I'm not interested in providing motivation if the motivation isn't intrinsic, right? Mm. I'm not going to be checking in. Did you practice? Like it's your learning, right? You're the one. If you want to achieve this, it's your work that's going to do that, right? But obviously that for some people, having a teacher who maybe has some of these goals to look forward to, okay, now we're going to achieve this and we're going to achieve this, gold star here and a gold star there, and that can be helpful. And again, it also, I think, depends very much, on the person and the age and the setting. And again, I think it would be different if you were a university student and I felt that professionally I wanted you to have achieved this skill and this skill by the time you graduate. But the beautiful thing about sort of private lessons is that it's on your terms, right? I mean, you're trying to learn what you want to learn, right? And I'm trying to help you learn what it is that you want to learn, as well as, of course. So I don't want to provide motivation when motivation isn't there, but I can hopefully provide inspiration and suggestions as well, right? Because again, sometimes finding the right piece can be so motivating. I know for myself, right there, that even as a professional, where if I'm hired to play a particular piece, I will play that piece, right? That there is some music that I connect to more than others, and so you get a certain piece. And I remember learning the Moldau for the first time, and just I couldn't stop playing it, right? Because I just loved it so much. And so I think that's something one skill that a teacher can help. But again, every teacher is going to have different strengths in different areas, and every student is going to have different direction and different needs in different areas. And so hopefully at some point you find a good mix that matches up.
And to go back to goal setting, let's say you're gonna work in a framework that you don't have a goal, because I was gonna ask you what happens when you don't meet a goal, but we have established that we're not really a very goal setting type of people here. What do you do to develop your resilience so that when things are not going so well that you still can soldier on? I guess that's the question for you, because
Well, I mean, that's life, right? Yeah, for sure. But again, I think that idea that as much as possible, rather than having sort of these peaks and valleys of, oh, I succeeded, yay, and oh, I failed, boo, that if you can have small little peaks and valleys, oh, I succeeded here today and I failed, that helps even things out. And I think, if you have the luxury of that, of trying to build on what succeeds and to learn from and move on from what doesn't succeed, then that's one way to build resiliency. And again, I mean, just the ups and downs of life, right? I mean, it's how do we cope, right? How do we build the resiliency? But I do think that there are some advantages to not getting too caught up in feeling you have to meet a particular goal.
So I have a friend of mine who has this practice that when their kids score well in an exam at school, they don't get a reward. They will celebrate that success instead of giving them a reward. There's this research that shows that sometimes when you have that reward of the goal of doing that activity will override sort of your motivation. What are your thoughts on that? You think my friend is onto something in not giving their kids a reward and doing a little celebration instead?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the celebration could be viewed as a reward as well. I think that's actually two interesting things to explore there. Because I definitely think there is research that tends to show that for children, if they're interested in doing an activity, but then they start being given rewards for doing that, eventually, not immediately, but eventually, those rewards will become the reason that they do it instead of that maybe initial intrinsic interest and desire to do it. Potentially, goals could be substituted in this case, same thing as rewards, that we might find ourselves doing things just for the goal rather than for, again, the intrinsic desire to do it. I also think there's research that potentially tends to suggest that if we are rewarded or praised for results, we tend to be less resilient than if we're rewarded or praised for effort. So that, in other words, saying, oh, you did this, you must be really talented or you must be really smart. What happens when you fail? Well, then you must not be very talented and you must be dumb. Whereas if, oh, you did this, you must have worked really hard, then if you fail, it's like, oh, maybe there's a different way you could work on that, right? So yeah, I think it's an interesting way to think about things for oneself as well, that to not try to label yourself too quickly and instead, again, to focus on the process, right?
There is a quote in the book Option B that Sheryl Sandberg and Adam Grant wrote that really resonated with me. And she said, "Let me fall if I must. The one I become will catch me." And I think that is such a great attitude to think about. Just, we talk about the ups and downs and whatnot, right? And I was going to ask you, like, what are you going to do when you don't meet the goal? But I guess to you, it's not really meeting the goal that matters, which I think in many ways, that's what that is telling you, is that, you will one day become that person who can catch you, even if you fall down. And I think what you said there really remind me of that mindset, that, perhaps if you don't fixate on meeting a goal and just keeping that longer term outcome in mind, you might be better off.
And it's interesting because I find that some people, it's hard to avoid comparisons, right? It's hard not to watch this video and see, oh, this little 7-year-old is playing this amazing piece.
Don't even remind me that.
What's the point? But I can understand that in a sense of, if you want to be the best in the world, then everybody else is competition, right? So for me, learning, say, the violin or the piano, I have no particular professional aspirations in that regard. So why would I be worried or threatened or care what anybody else is doing? Because all that matters is what I'm doing at that instrument. And I know, of course, that there are little 5-year-olds, 3-year-olds playing violin, 5-year-olds playing violin better than I could ever play, right? But I think it's hard, right? It's hard, but I think the more that we can free ourselves from that mindset of needing to compare and say, well, I better meet that goal of playing as well as that little kid, because otherwise, what am I doing with my life? And it's tricky because we want, no matter how much we might fall in love with the process, it's easier if you feel that there is some positive reinforcement. Yes, I'm succeeding, right? But to match your goals with your, I guess, with your own effort, and to celebrate those wins, right? and to not worry too much about the non-successes, and to not compare too much, right? To what anybody else is doing.
Yeah. I think the only fair comparison we have is to our own self.
Yeah,
Because I remember when I was learning piano, my teacher, she got all her the exams, because everyone take exam around the same time, so she got all the results back, and she was stacking up, all the people that are in the same grade, and she's like, "Oh, you got the second highest score of the grade, whatever." And I'm like, "Okay," and she's like, "Well, don't you want to be the highest?" I'm like, "Yeah." There's always going to be someone that is going to do better than me. Right? And there's always going to be someone, hopefully, that do worse than me. I'm okay being number 2. I don't need to be number 1. I want to do better for myself, but I don't necessarily see that I need to compare. And I think it gets hard when you try to make it into a profession, right? Like I remember myself distinctly, like not wanting to get into photography as a career. Part of it is because I even if I don't compare myself with other people, that's what other people is going to do.
Of course.
Right? Because, there are a million of them out there. They're going to pick and choose who they want. But even then, I don't think there is necessarily one set of criteria that would draw people to one or the other. And I think it's the same in any of the arts kind of fields, right?
Well, and that's where I think, especially as someone who is learning an instrument just for the love of learning it, you have that freedom to not feel you need to compare yourself to anybody else. Again, it's tricky because I do think there can be that burst of excitement and motivation and desire and interest if you feel that you are very good at something, right, and better than everybody else. But that's also, there's only so many people who can, that's excluding all these people who maybe aren't. Okay, so you're second in the grade level, but what about all the people who were lower, right? How are they feeling? And then it also, it's like it potentially catches up with you at some point, right? Where you think about sports people who may be always the best athlete in their city or whatever, in their age bracket, and then maybe eventually at some point they just don't make it on the pro level because so many people, right? So it's tricky. Like, I think if you're getting that sort of feedback, go ahead and ride it, but to not seek that out, I guess.
Or not to rely on it to be the only reason why you're enjoying. Because I think what I'm hearing you say is that you want to be the reason that you're happy about doing this, not necessarily for the external validations, even though they're nice.
Yeah. Well, and again, it's hard to work in a vacuum, right? It's hard to work in a vacuum as much as one might want to. That, of course, we all enjoy getting some validation and some appreciation for whatever we're doing, right? Mm-hmm. But yeah, to try to again, that balance, to try to not have it be the only reason you're doing it, or the sole, or the determining factor.
That's great. So is it safe to say that you're not going to make me set learning goals for 2022 then?
Well, so I did read that apparently there is research that seems to suggest that the timing of setting goals is not all time is equal. So that setting it on significant days, which could be the start of the year, whatever, gives you a higher chance of like continuing a habit. I think this is more sort of habits. Again, it's like, is it a goal, is it a habit, or whatever. So, I mean, if you want to set a goal for 2022, go for it. But no, I'm not gonna.
Perfect.
I'm not gonna have you set one.
Yeah, and to me, it's always been kind of arbitrary, like the calendar year comes to an end. Let's set something new. I'm like, I'm still working on my 2021 goal. I mean, I got a couple of days, but it's pieces I started in 2021 is not done yet. So.
Well, and again, I think environment is such a hidden and unrecognized aspect of what we do, right? That, I don't know, supposedly, if for college-bound students who wanted to change their exercise regime, wanted to exercise more, they were 3 times more likely to do that if they moved to go to a different college than if they stayed where they were. At the same time, if you had an exercise regime you were happy with, you were less likely to keep it if you moved, right? So that the environment that we're in can play a huge role in habits and goals or whatever, in behavior and processes. So if you're unhappy with what you're doing, right, with what you're achieving, whatever, that potentially trying to change the environment somehow is actually potentially an effective way to do that maybe gets overlooked a little bit, that's not talked about in the same way that, say, goal setting is.
Environment. I'm gonna have to think about that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, but I guess I will give you an example of that several years ago I was in Europe and I had a fairly extended stop in one city. I didn't have a harp, but the local harpist was kind enough to let me go to the university and practice there. And so you had to sign up for a room at a certain time, and you had a 2-hour window, and no connectivity, right? There was terrible reception there, and you only had those 2 hours. And so that was really motivating to make good use of it, right? Because that was it. And you're left wanting more. Whereas if you're at home and the harp's always there and you practice whenever you want, you may get to the end of the day and you haven't done as much as you wanted, right? So that wasn't, the result of that wasn't because I set a goal or anything. It was just that environment forced this behavior very easily, as opposed to struggling to set a habit that sometimes the environment can set it for you. But often that maybe it's not necessarily a small thing, right? Like it's a big, yeah. If you go move somewhere where the only thing in your room is a harp, and you're probably going to spend a lot of time with a harp, but yeah, it's a bit extreme.
I think it forces you to think differently, for sure. Like I speak for myself, not everyone, but working a full-time job, being a mom and all, I don't have a lot of time. It's very hard for me to even predict, right, when I'm going to have free time. So what happened is that when I do have an opportunity at the harp, like I basically ask myself, what is the most efficient way I'm going to be able to get through my stuff? So instead of just sitting there and like saying, oh, I got the next 3 hours, do, right. A and B and C, I'm just like, okay, how can I get through this very efficiently? And that trains me in a very different way, right? Than say like when I'm on holiday, which, like I said, I have been around 2 weeks. I haven't wrapped up my 2021 pieces yet, so don't be too disappointed in our first lesson. But yeah, like I have the harp with me the whole time. I barely touched it. So I think, yeah, there's something to be said about your surrounding and how it impacts you. And I think in those cases, like, even the best goal doesn't help me, because like I had a ton of practice goals set up for the winter break that didn't necessarily happen. But
no, exactly. Well, and that's why I always suggest that, sure, you could leave your dust cover on your harp overnight, for example, which in theory maybe it protects it some small amount from dust, but it's that one extra step, because then if you want to practice, if you want to play the harp, you have to take the dust cover off. And again, that environment, if the harp's sitting there saying, oh, ready to be played, and again, if you have to move it or something, well, that's one extra step. And again, just trying to have the environment serve that purpose that you want, as much as you can. I think it's, again, maybe an under talked about aspect.
Yeah. So I think what I'm hearing is have that large, broad goal, but maybe not fixate on how you're going to do it in terms of having it all mapped out, and really enjoy the process and let that become a routine that sort of slowly guide you and bring you to that greater goal.
Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay, so Victoria, free from 2022 learning goal. But I hope I will continue to make beautiful music with you.
Exactly. I expect a 20-page essay and
Yeah, you get something from me. It might not be very meaningful, but that's awesome. Very interesting insight into how you look at goal setting and just approaching work. I think in general, how you manage to get things done. And I really enjoy the your emphasis on the process and making it a routine. I think that is so important because you can set all the goals in the world, and if you don't have a habit of making it, working towards it, it's not going to happen. So I think that is very important. And also, that what you just talked about in terms of the environment, that's also
For sure.
very important. Thank you very much for chatting with me about this, and hopefully you're not gonna, hopefully Team TH, you're not gonna get too disappointed to learn that Josh doesn't have a giant sticky notes that has all his plan mapped out, but worked out okay. So I love learning different ways of thinking from people. So thank you so much for sharing your thought with us.
Oh, this has been a blast.
Awesome.
So thanks for having me on.
Thank you.